Hello, and thanks for joining the webinar, Post-COVID, New Irish Studies. My name is Patrick Griffin. I am the Madden Henneberry Professor of History here at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm the Director of the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies. In this pandemic year, when travel, guest lectures, and visits to campus have been impossible, we've worked to try to foster a sense of community within Irish Studies by an informal consortium that we've called the Global Irish Network. Within this network, we've promoted webinars of global interests. Topics that we've pursued have included the role of a global university in a global pandemic, Irish universities and imperial legacies, and the troubles, the COVID pandemic, unexpected death, and complex grief. Today's webinar explores how COVID has transformed the educational landscape of what we do as instructors and as researchers in the field of Irish studies. This is going to cap to our academic year. As momentum for vaccines increases, we look forward to a return of normalcy when we can meet once again and when our campuses can be what we thought they were before. But today we want to talk about what's happened in the meantime and how we can and maybe should adjust some of the things that we've done in the past. Today, panelists from several institutions will reflect on their teaching and research experiences during this difficult year and offer ideas about which practices work best, as well as which we should carry forward, and maybe those that we shouldn't. As we do move forward, despite the many sorrows and stresses of this past year, I'm grateful for a greater sense of community within Irish studies that this year has brought for many of us. That's one of the ironies of this year. We've gotten to see a lot more of each other, even if it's been on Zoom. And I hope that we will all continue to work to forge bonds of mutual understanding as we move ahead, as we all seek to kind of understand Ireland, its many facets, and its many facets of its diaspora in both historical and contemporary times. I want to thank my colleague, my dear colleague, Brian O'Connor, who's a faculty member here of the Irish Language and Literature Department. He conceived of today's event, and he's organized the panel. He's going to introduce each of the several panelists briefly and then moderate the discussions after their presentations. Thanks, Brian, and I turn it over to you, my friend. You're muted.
Classic. Thanks, Pat. Much appreciated. Thank you for allowing us for hosting this today. So thank you to those who are joining us from all over the US, Europe, and South America as well. Around the year 2010, universities began to explore with MOOC courses. But COVID has changed the educational landscape in such a dramatic fashion that it has now been reformulated in a way that was unimaginable 15 months ago. We have convened today a panel of professors, educators, academics, university presidents, and provosts to discuss how we move forward. How do we grapple with the challenge of digital technology? We'll hear about podcasts, we'll hear about new approaches, we'll hear about hybrid models of teaching. So the question we are addressing today is, how do we capture the best of pre-COVID practices? And how do we marry them to the tremendous power of digital technology? And with that, I will ask Professor Michael Brown, who is the Director of the Centre for Scottish and Irish Studies at the University of Aberdeen, to join us and share his thoughts with us. Michael, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Brian. I should say, by way of introduction, I'm slightly moving away from the specific brief about teaching practices and so forth. But what I want to try and think about in my remarks is how the experience of the pandemic might actually serve to refashion Irish studies itself as a locus for study. I want to argue that in bringing us closer to a sense of our mortality, the events of the last 12 months has relocated human experience as in many ways closer to the supernatural and to the divine. COVID has both privatized and medicalized death to an inordinate degree. The tragic consequences of the transmissibility of the illness demands that death is both lonely and frequently within caring facilities. The grief process has also been privatized to a distressing extent, with limits being put on the number of mourners allowed at funerals, for example. But it had also been a deeply public experience, with death totals announced by politicians in daily briefings, and the breadth of loss reaching into every locality, invading every friendship network, and altering all of our lives. Relatives and friends have succumbed, and the pervasive threat of the disease and the social isolation that was in the early days of the pandemic the sole effective means of slowing its progress has resulted in a shadow pandemic of mental ill health, with which we are all dealing. Irish Studies, I think, has a ready vocabulary to deal with all of this, dwelling as it repeatedly does on such issues as miracle cures, faith in invisible forces, and the nature of the afterlife. And there are studies that can set us on our path. For instance, Eugene Hines has offered us an extensive treatment of apparitions at Knock. Brendan McSwivna has recounted a ghost story from Thanet. Donald Akinson has recently explored the apocalyptic musings of the Trinity College educated originators of the Plymouth Brethren. Taken together, these exploratory works are suggestive of how a concentration on the uncanny, the unhomely, the weird, and the macabre might help us read with a fresh eye, work within standard themes of Irish studies, such as the penal code, religious bigotry, or sectarian conflict. All of these are now infused with an anxious energy that can be underplayed or dismissed when the ear is not attuned to the possibility of the paranormal, the supernatural, and the afterlife. Now, beyond my own discipline of history, Christina Moran has documented the concern of Irish writers for the Gothic in the half-century around 1800. The Gothic aspect of the big house novel of the 20th century is readily apparent in John Bandle's Birchwood of 1973, or more recently in Tana French's The Likeness of 2008. Jarlath Colleen has similarly suggested that this concern emerges from Ireland's fractured sense of religious bipolarity. In this, the bilingualism of the country can equally enrich our exposition further. A country and communities that live in the liminal spaces of translations, transliterations, macaronic language, and code switching can also move between this world and the next. However, Irish studies will need to be cognizant of the risks implicit in the contemporary secularisation of Ireland, which removes us from even the recent past. Weekly attendance at Mass amongst Catholics of 91% in 1972-3 has declined to some 30% in 2016. The Irish have, in the last half-century, dramatically withdrawn from the houses of worship that scatter their landscape. Our imaginative distance from the religiosity that shaped Ireland deep into the 20th century may make us prone to the scholarly sin of condescension. In this, I think, adjectives matter. Parochial, deferential, primitive, and superstitious are all used as means to dismiss the faith and its adherents. They are derogatory terms that accord with modernity's self-fashioning as individualistic, democratic, capitalist, and secular. Now, let me be clear. This is not a call to a return to the faith-based histories of church life, the hagiographies of local saints' lives and religious leaders, or the defense of doctrinal positions in the rehearsal of their historical emergence or contestation. Rather, what I'm asking for is closer to what Rita Felsky has proposed, a rejection of the hermeneutics of suspicion and an admission of the possibility of wonder. Wonder that things might be other than we think. Wonder that people believed and believe with conviction that the miraculous is mundane. Robert Orsi has observed in History and Presence that we need to recognize that miracles and the paranormal were true to the subjects that we write about, as true and meaningful in their lives as economic forces, political trends, and social dynamics. We need to explore not just how the past now looks to our secularized minds, but humbly explore how it was seen and understood by those who saw the barrier between the secular and the spiritual as porous, liminal, and passable. The challenge and the opportunity then is to reinvest the field of Irish studies with a sense of the uncanny, the weird, and the marvellous. It might permit us to realise in the literature an awareness of the need to balance the concern with trauma with the desire for splendour. Doing so might also let us reimagine the stakes for Irish studies itself, while allowing us a means of addressing the gaps created in our society by the pandemic, the loss that it has involved, and allows us then to vocalise our sense of suffering and our desire for the eternal and the meaningful. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker is Kate Costello-Sullivan, President of the ACIS and former Dean and Professor at Lamoine College.
Thanks, Brian, for the invitation to be here. It's nice to see some familiar faces and to meet some new ones. I'm going to focus first on the challenges the pandemic posed, not just for the ACIS members generally, but particularly for contingent and graduate scholars, as well as those who are teaching at smaller liberal arts colleges like my own. But then I want to consider the unexpected ways that the move to online formats yielded unanticipated opportunities, particularly for those same populations in terms of both access and equity. So having spent, as Brian mentioned, 5 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Le Moyne, I wasn't surprised by the strain the pandemic caused throughout academia. What was particularly pointed, however, was the intensity of that strain for colleges with smaller endowments. In a report issued by the AAUP on 12 April, they note, quote, real wages for full-time faculty decreased for the first time since the Great Recession. And average wage growth for all ranks of full-time faculty was the lowest since the AAUP began tracking annual wage growth in 1972. The report further notes that salary freezes or reductions occurred at 48% of 2A master's granting institutions and 62% of 2B baccalaureate colleges. 28% of the master's institutions eliminated or reduced fringe benefits, and 38% did the same at baccalaureate colleges. We've all also heard about the freezing of travel expenses in the time of COVID, but at many less well-endowed colleges, such funding had already been reduced or eliminated. And lastly, of course, there's an emotional cost to the loss of such travel and conference opportunities. For academic singletons, so to speak, isolated Irish scholars at small liberal arts campuses, the ACIS provides more than just a chance to present a paper. It's also a source of intellectual nourishment, disciplinary camaraderie, and networking. And this is where the unexpected benefits of the resort to Zoom comes in. First, for scholars without the resources of a large, well-endowed institution, Zoom meetings offered opportunities to attend lectures, programming, and events that would have been entirely inaccessible to them, even pre-COVID. This is particularly pointed in that many events have proven to be international. For members with restricted travel opportunities, of course, this has been a boon. Members of the ACIS have also been able to participate in regional conferences from wherever they are around the country, instead of having to adhere to their geographical location owing to cost constraints. And that's allowed for sort of regional cross-pollination in a way that the national conference even can't do. This virtual environment has also enabled dynamic and creative new collaborations. The ACIS has partnered with the Irish Embassy and consulates around the United States, establishing a firmer cooperative relationship and co-hosting high-profile events like the Ambassador's Hour to launch cutting-edge work in Irish studies. Faculty have been guest lecturing all over the place because they can. I hosted lecturers from Ireland, Wisconsin, and Texas in the past month in my classes alone. Lastly, in launching a new named lecture series at my institution, Le Moyne, we were able to showcase a scholar from Illinois while welcoming an audience from all over the world. It's difficult to overstate what this means for faculty who pre-COVID had neither the resources nor the geographical or institutional advantages of larger institutions. For such scholars, the past 18 months, for all their challenges, may well have been among the most intellectually stimulating in a good while. So where does this leave us? The ACIS recognizes that with funding foreshortened or cut, and with some colleges in actual precarity, we may need to consider whether, going forward, availing remote options would be not only practical, but ethical and more inclusive. Our conference this coming year, which I'm sure Maliki will discuss, will be wholly virtual. There are scholars who do not travel or who cannot travel who now look forward to being there. So I guess I would leave on the question, as much as we all value interpersonal contact, as much as we look forward to seeing much missed colleagues and to sharing a hug and perhaps a pint at a conference, do we not need, in a time of climate change, academic austerity, and for some professional precarity, to consider whether there is a way to reinstitute those precious interpersonal moments, but not to deny others the chance for connection, camaraderie, and intellectual rapport, which, for those who would otherwise be academically isolated, feels anything but virtual. Many thanks.
Gormagat, Kate, and thank you for your leadership of the ACIS during 2 very, very difficult years. Our next speaker is Professor Eugene Wall, who is the president of Mary Immaculate College, Limerick, Ireland.
Thank you very much, Breen. So I'm going to take a panoramic view from an Irish perspective as somebody who is president of Institute of Higher Education in Ireland. Looking back over the 13 months in Ireland since we have entered into lockdown, I would say that overall in Ireland, since that time, we have weathered what at the time looked like a looming cataclysm last March. And I think we've weathered that much better than would be expected. Bear in mind that between March and last June, many institutions in Ireland, higher education institutions, universities, institutes of technology, would not have faced the future with any form of confidence around their financial situation. And some institutions were facing the possibility of serious financial insolvency. In fact, had the government persisted with the approach which they had adopted in response to the austerity era, rather than adopt counter-cyclical economic policies, many institutions would not have survived economically. So I think that's the first thing I would like to say. Having said that, I think that we have done much better. I think such a generalization begs much analysis, and there's much that happened over the last 30 months that I think could be described as the good, the bad, and the indifferent. If I can concentrate, given the shortness of my remarks here, if I can concentrate in two particular areas. The first has got to do with the whole area of conferences, and the second one is to do with teaching. In relation to conferences, I am picking up on some of the points that Kate has made a few moments ago. And I would cite two examples of two very contrasting experiences dating back to last February. Last February, we ran a book launch in the college, which was highly successful. It had an attendance far bigger than would have ever been possible in pre-COVID times. It was due to be attended by the minister, who under normal circumstances would not travel. So in purely functional terms, it was highly successful. I think the sort of collaboration that's taking place here today is another example of some of the possibilities that might not have occurred in pre-COVID times. In contrast to that, however, for example, I attended the AERA, American Education Research Association, last week, and that was beset by very considerable technical difficulties, which required a number of workarounds. That's a conference which has a normal attendance of 14,000, and there were 14,000 virtual attendees last week. But the conference that I had the biggest contrast with was with ACCU, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities in America, which takes place every year annually in January. And I attended that virtually last February, and I had done so in previous years in person. If you look at that in purely functional terms, it was highly successful. Both in terms of the organization of the material, the presentations, the ability to review the particular sessions, the ability to swap from one session to another, and not to mention the huge savings in time that happened as a result of my not having to travel to the United States. However, I would say that it was a pale shadow of previous conferences. And from my perspective, the outcomes, the professional outcomes, were not remotely comparable. The reason for that was, and I think it touches on one of the challenges that we face with virtual conferences such as this, is that the conference was shorn of the opportunity to network and to build social capital, which is an integral component of those sorts of conferences. The possibility of meeting up spontaneously with individuals in a non-planned way, the serendipity of bumping into somebody and having a conference which enables you to engage in a whole range of issues which are about, as I say, building social capital, but they're also about building the connectedness with individuals, which leads to the follow-up interactions. Not only that, but on the side of that particular conference each year, we would go to the American Embassy, where we would meet with the Irish ambassador. It would give us an opportunity to talk about a whole range of developments. And every second year, it gives us the possibility of running an event in the embassy for our partner institutions. None of that was possible this particular year. And I think that this, for me, highlights that, at least from my perspective, from any cost-benefit analysis, the professional outcomes would be clear to me. Now, given the positive tone of the conference, I really don't want to adopt a deficit view on this, and I don't want to be succumbing to what could be described as either or thinking. I do believe that we can capitalize on the new affordances of technology without forfeiting the key relational benefits that I think are an integral and essential part of conferences. In relation to teaching, I cast my mind back again to the 13th of September of March last year, when the national lockdown required us to migrate our teaching and administrative activities online. I think, like most institutions in Ireland at that stage, we coped effectively. In real terms, we survived, and given the circumstances, we celebrated what was widely described as the pivot. However, we recognized that most people were thrown in at the deep end, and on reflection, what we provided at that time to our students, even though it was a great source of relief to them and to us, was suboptimal and not sustainable in quality terms for the following year. I think there were particular concerns that were expressed around the level of student engagement, possibility, as happened to me in the early stages on a Teams call. You had students who were there, but the images were not on. So the issue of engagement. And another issue which has very much been prominent in Ireland, I'm saying this as somebody who's a member of the National Higher Education's Steering Committee on COVID, the issue of student welfare and student well-being is something that has very much come into prominence. And whereas we were able to cater very much for students in terms of their cognitive needs and their learning needs, the difficulties that we experienced were most acute in the area of how, as a college which intends to be caring towards our students, how do we supplement that relational dimension to the work which wasn't achievable online. If I can say one further element, that people, when pitched in at the deep end, they used technologies which were, I would think, perforce limited. I think what happened over the summer was that a lot of individuals recognized that this was not sustainable. And what they did then was to invest time and energy in capacity building, in upskilling. And as we move nationally, which we're inexorably doing, towards a hybrid model next semester, when we probably will have large classes which will still remain online unless the vaccine rollout proves to be outstandingly successful. We'll end up with a hybrid model that has large lectures online and small group teaching. I think what you're going to find there is, having pushed through the resistance that some faculty members would have had for remaining in their pedagogical comfort zones, many of those will be reluctant to let that go. So I think we're going to find ourselves in a new area where it won't be only small groups or large groups that will be done online. People will build upon the capacity that they have acquired over the last year, and I think that's one very positive outcome from our COVID experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Eugene, and the best of wishes with the growing Irish Studies programme at Mary Immaculate, and we look forward to seeing you when Mary Immaculate hosts the ACIS in the coming years. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Mcateer from the Catholic University of Budapest.
Sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. You can hear me and see me okay. Thank you very much, Bream, for this invitation to speak at this online seminar. I'm going to take just a brief kind of microcosmic rather than general reflective approach to this question. So at the Institute of English and American Studies here at Pázmány University in Budapest, I teach several BA courses covering Irish drama, poetry, fiction, film, as well as an introductory lecture BA course on Irish history. I also teach Irish writing as part of MA seminars on Irish, Scottish, and English writing in the 19th and 20th centuries. During the autumn semester of 2020, the Institute of English and American Studies moved its teaching program to a hybrid format. with lectures given on campus and seminars delivered via Microsoft Teams. From late October 2020, all teaching was switched to MS Teams online format, and it has remained this way since. So these are my experiences of this transition to online teaching. As regards improvements, first of all, finding suitable teaching spaces has been a challenge at Pasmine University because the campus at which the Faculty of Humanities was based, which is about 20 kilometers outside the city, had to relocate to a Budapest city location during the past 6 years. And this has generated a lot of upheaval, including scattering the faculty across different locations in the city. Teaching seminars online via MS Teams has allowed me to conduct classes without the problems generated by city traffic noise or rooms that were too small to facilitate groups of 15 plus students in seminars. MS Teams offers a superior range of communication tools for seminar groups to that of email or of the Neptune system that Pasmine University uses to register all students for their seminar and lecture courses. MS Teams has allowed me to communicate with groups and with individual students quite easily, dispensing with the need to assemble student email lists for seminar groups at the start of semester. MS Teams also allows me to share seminar course descriptions, scanned book chapters, relevant web links, YouTube videos, so on, with students simply by uploading to the files section for individual MS Teams seminar or lecture groups. One of the best features of MS Teams is the assignments option, which makes continual assessment exercises a lot easier to manage for multiple BA and MA seminar groups. Although I ran into some problems operating it at first, I have come to find the breakout option for MS Teams meetings to be quite effective, allowing students to conduct exercises in subgroups before returning to the main online meeting for a seminar. The pre-recording of lectures via MS Teams is also useful in that it remains available on the system for 2 weeks, giving the students the option of viewing it sometime after the scheduled time and date for the lecture. So those are the positive developments that I found with the move to online. What about the drawbacks? When the hybrid teaching format was introduced at the beginning of autumn 2020, this created schedule problems for many students. Students were required to be present on campus for lectures on certain days, while also having to come online for seminars. The result was that some students were joining my seminars via their smartphones while on city bus journeys to or from campus. One student even joined a seminar group while sitting in her car parked outside the campus building close to the River Danube. The traffic behind her made it look rather like a scene from a 1950s American movie. I've found that the longer online teaching has gone on, the more difficult it has become to have spontaneous conversation and dialogue with students or between students. This lack of spontaneity is exacerbated by troubleshooting problems. Some students have had poor Wi-Fi connections at times. In virtually every MS Teams seminar group that I have taught since last September, there has been an occasion when there was interruption in the broadcast of the voice as an individual student was speaking. Encouraging students for whom English is a second or even a third language in a country where the national language, Hungarian, is so distant from English has been a great challenge for me in Budapest over the past 9 years in teaching Irish studies. In some cases, the switch to online teaching has actually helped. For example, one student told me last autumn semester that she felt a lot more comfortable participating in online discussion from her home than within a live class on campus. For the most part, however, getting students to speak in seminar has not been helped by the MS Teams format. So finally, a couple of recommendations for future Irish studies teaching practice internationally to consider. A hybrid teaching format, in my view, should be retained and developed, but it will require a lot of university planning and investment. It is extremely important that staff and students gain the social experience of university life for their psychological welfare and intellectual development. But issues around noise pollution, transportation, and climate change make some continued online teaching a distinct advantage. Final point, most of my colleagues at Pasmine University English and American Studies Department are reluctant to embrace the following proposal, but I believe that it could help staff and students enormously in our present circumstances. When I was a first-year BA student of English at Maynooth University over 32 years ago, I had tutorials with Dr. Peter Denman every second week. Looking back, it was a really good model that could work well via the online medium in the present times. Back in the early 1990s, this fortnightly tutorial format allowed us the time to find our way with reading and complete any written exercise that the tutor set for us. In the current circumstances, having a week without a seminar meeting online gives students the time to complete and upload a written exercise, such as, for example, identifying and summarizing some critical sources for the text that is to be discussed in seminar. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. And we go from Budapest to Paris. And Kurmit Falter Riv Pliana Ní Riordan.
I want to begin by reading the end of the prologue from a book of non-fiction written by Karini Doherty. It's a book called Thin Places. And she says, as she comes to the conclusion of her prologue, there are places like this one, which are so thin that you meet yourself in the still point. Like the lifting of the silky veil on Samhain, you are held in the space in between. No matter the past, the present, or what is yet to come, there is nothing you can do but listen for the gap in the silence, the change in the wind. And I think that if I reflect on the experience that we in Paris have had during this pandemic year, teaching online, it's very much like that. We are in this thin in-between space, a paradoxical moment of increased intimacy and increased isolation. And I think if I look in three ways, first of all, at my own teaching practice, second, at our research program, and third, on French studies, both in France and in a Europe-wide level, we can see this being borne out. An increased intimacy at teaching level because of the fact that for legal reasons, we are not obliged to force our students to put on their cameras. So very often students who are shy and timid have more courage in a classroom situation. And they don't feel the look of other people on them and are prepared to volunteer information in a space which I think is perhaps non-threatening. Increased isolation because as a public state-funded university, which has a remit to cater for students from a large socioeconomic background, we have also experienced a digital divide, la fracture digitale, as they say in France, where we have had to supply laptops to students who didn't have any, where we have had to supply hotspots to students on campus because of the fact that in their own accommodation, they had neither Wi-Fi connections nor the peace and quiet to attend class comfortably. And at the same time, I think we have had an experience of increased empathy. And the French university model is not one in which pastoral care has a tradition of being important. But in this age of the pandemic, the newspapers have been full of our obligation to care for our students, and an awareness of student mental health and well-being has been placed front and center. Universities across Paris have organized food banks for students who usually in big cities like Paris would survive on babysitting jobs, which are no longer to be had, on part-time jobs in bookshops, libraries, fast foods, all of which are closed. So it has been a moment of awareness and empathy for the most vulnerable in society, which I think is admirable. From the perspective of our research group in Irish Studies, last night we had a launch for a book where we had many participants, not just from all over France, but from Ireland, from the USA, and from Britain. And our talks, I think, throughout this year have been better attended than they have been in the past years. And I think for us, what we are looking forward to is we're looking forward to a hybrid future, which seems to us to be inescapable. But to secure this hybrid future, I would suggest that what we need is investment in the technological means to supply good technical support, adequate platforms, adequate training for members of staff. This morning I was on a Zoom call with more elderly members of faculty, some of whom, not in my own institution, were considering retiring because the prospect of a continued hybrid future is terrifying for them. And in conclusion, I would say that what this university pandemic year has left, it has left a huge resource base of webinars and podcasts. It has led to people on a French level in Irish Studies wanting to coordinate doctoral and research seminars monthly from next year. And it has enabled the Ephesus program, the European Federation for Centres of Irish Studies across Europe, to come together on a program which I think enables all masters and doctoral students to join in and to communicate and not to feel excluded, no matter what their income level and their support base may be. Thank you.
We will go from Paris to Prague. Professor André Pilny, who is the current president of ICEL and also director of the Irish Studies program at Prague.
Thank you very much, Brian. I've approached the task somewhat like Michael Mcateer in that in preparing for it, I put together a list of positive developments and negative developments. I'll start with the positive ones, and inevitably I'll repeat things that some of my predecessors said here, but hopefully not too many. First of all, what has been positive about all these lockdowns is the spreading of digital literacy amongst ourselves as instructors, but also amongst students. We as teachers were forced to rethink the way we teach, and we achieve engagement from the students, and that has been great, I think. There has been an increased availability of resources in a digital format, and that's absolutely vital for those of us who are far away from Ireland. I work these days mostly on drama and theatre, and of course the number of theatre performances that have been made available in digital format has been just unparalleled. Same would go for authors' readings, interviews with writers, etc., etc. There have been some excellent examples of good practice of using the digital environments. Cliona has just mentioned Ephesus, the European Federation of Irish Studies, which has converted its Irish itinerary program, which normally would tour Irish artists and musicians and writers across Europe, into a digital format, which has, for instance, allowed us to welcome Darach Oskoli, the publisher and writer in the Irish language, in one of our courses at an extremely cost-effective manner. The person otherwise might not be available. You might not have the resources to welcome them, and the engagement with the students was absolutely fantastic. I think that the that digital education generally has a great potential to reach out to those people who'd otherwise be excluded from university education, and that goes both for physically handicapped people who might still find it extremely difficult to live in cities with old-fashioned, old-style sort of architecture of universities, but also to the socially excluded, because this certainly is a way of decreasing the costs of being a student. On the other hand, all in all, I suppose the negative aspects of the developments would prevail on my list, I'm afraid. Even if you go back to the available digital resources, some of those cannot fully replace the live ones. To go back to my example of a theatre performance, watching a theatre performance on screen is certainly not the same experience as watching it live in the theatre, particularly given the current research in affect, for instance, and essentially in audience response to shows and impact on audiences. Never mind music. If you happen to teach courses on music, replace a live concert with an online one. The possibilities of networking at conferences, as we've heard from Eugene Wall already, have been curbed to the absolute minimum, and that I think is a problem. There is also something that Kate Costello-Sullivan has already outlined so eloquently. I think there is an increased danger of further funding cuts in the humanities, because to a technocrat, why not limit the number of lectures once digital content has already been created? Why not limit the number of contact hours because of the same? For instance, one person can easily teach larger groups of students online than the 10 or 15 who might fit into the usual classroom, etc. The danger, of course, affects also the funding for travel and conferences and archival research. Of course, archives and libraries generally have not been accessible to any of us to do any research, and this may be severely affected in the future. And then to go back to the experience of a teacher, I think that face-to-face teaching on a certain level is simply irreplaceable. There's something that Michael Mcateer referred to as lack of spontaneity in digital education. I would certainly subscribe to that, because the human contact and immediate interaction, I think, is on a certain level absolutely crucial. If you think about students, I think that the physical experience of being a student is irreplaceable, in that informal social contact among students and between students and lecturers has essentially vanished. And let's face it, isn't this where many ideas and innovations are actually hatched, and where they come from? And we just don't have these opportunities anymore at the moment. Of course, the same goes for social interactions at conferences and research trips, where you have plenty of time to speak informally to your colleagues and come up with things that are innovative, with collaborations that otherwise would not have occurred. And finally, one last remark concerning the experience of being a student. Of course, one has vanished temporarily, let's hope, is the experience of being a visiting student. Yes, we in Europe still have a limited number of Erasmus students in our courses, but they study with us from home, and yes, they might have access to different kind of courses and a different kind of expertise, but they do not have that essential experience of living in another place and in another culture for an extended period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Our next speaker is Nessa Cronin, and we all have acknowledged the difficulties and the challenges of facing during a pandemic, but how many of us have been nominated for a President's Teaching Award during a pandemic? Our next speaker has Nessa from NUIG.
Okay, Gurmila Magat Brian. It's lovely to be here today, and I've been taking copious notes and observations from everybody, so I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the discussion later in particular as well. I'm just going to open with a couple of comments and then 2 or 3 key points, and then I'll move swiftly on then, because I know that time is of the essence here. Unevenly universal is how Rob Nixon describes human vulnerability to the environmental harm in his book Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. And if nothing but the theme of inequality and how the experience of COVID-19 has been unevenly universal is something I think that has resonated since in Ireland in particular since March 2020. I was teaching Roddy Doyle's The Deportees this semester, and in the foreword to that book, he says, and he's writing about kind of Celtic Tiger Ireland, he says, I went to bed in one country and woke up in another. And I think many of us felt that ourselves and our students as well when we went to bed one morning and then woke up and realized that everything has been switched and changed utterly in terms of our teaching and our learning experiences and challenges as well. The theme of inequality is something that I think we need to really keep to the fore in any discussions about teaching and pedagogy in Irish studies going forward into the future. A lot of focus and discussion has been about the inequality and the digital divide with students, which is really important. But I think we also have to be very mindful of staff and different kinds of staffing issues and employment circumstances that Kate has mentioned as well, in terms of our colleagues who are in more precarious forms of employment, and also colleagues moving around, early career researchers that are now not having the networking opportunities that they might have had before. As Eugene said as well, the online pivot that arrived in Ireland in March 2020, when Leo Varadkar announced the lockdown very dramatically from Washington, immediately everything shifted from an in-person face-to-face teaching into the online format. But as a friend and a colleague of mine said, we're not Ryanair, you just don't click and go. So it was really, really hard. It was really, really painful. It was really, really tiring. We were at the end of our second semester at NUI Galway when that happened. And I think many of us just kind of clung our way through the final weeks, and I think we kind of dragged our students along with us as well. In Irish Studies in Galway over the summer, we took an opportunity when we were able to travel and meet up outside. We had intensive teaching discussions, and we actually shifted entirely. Our whole focus was on teaching and how we were going to create a kind of a considered curriculum that was going to be different, because not all materials were going to be available online. So we might have to tailor and change things, but also which was really important for us, was to create consistency for our students, because there was going to be so many different ways that they were interacting with their colleagues and with their academic staff online as well. So consistency was really, really important for us. What I found personally is that teaching online is really hard. It's really hard to stop being didactic. It's very easy to see it as an information overload, and you're just piling information on the screen. To get the nuances and the distinctions between political nationalism in the 19th century and cultural nationalism in the 19th century, to be able to pick up on all of those kinds of little critical elements that are so key to particularly a humanities education, is very, very difficult when you have Zoom screens freezing, you have microphones that don't work, and you have students that are reluctant to put on their screens. Just a couple of recommendations before we kind of move on to the general Q&A. I think, first of all, the theme of inequality for staff and students has to be front and center in terms of any risk management in the future. I think the student experience and what it's like to be on the back end of a phone in a car in Budapest trying to listen into their lecture, I think that has to be experienced. We have the digital divide in Galway, where we have a national broadband strategy that is totally disastrous. And the hybrid model that many universities are probably going to move to, that Eugene mentioned as well, that's going to be really problematic in terms of timetabling. We had that problem in Galway where we had no places for the students to go while they were watching on their screens before they were going into a physical class in an hour's time. And there are real issues that need to be addressed about all of that. Finally, I actually polled my students. I asked my students, I'm doing this thing on Friday and we're going to be talking about Irish studies and teaching online, and what do you guys think? So I did an anonymous poll with my first years and second years, and it was really interesting. I gave them 3 options. 1/3 of them would want sole on-campus teaching. They want to be fully back on campus in September. 2/3 want a mix of online campus teaching and hybrid learning, online learning, and 0% want full online learning, which I thought was really interesting. So for the technocrats out there, take a note. Your customers don't want that. They want the face-to-face engagement and the nuance and the chat, and maybe hopefully a pint in the college bar afterwards as well too. Just finally then, and I think this is what Cliona brought up as well, and I think it was really, really nicely put, where she said that we had both increased intimacy, but also increased isolation as well. And I think we're going to be moving and shifting across those. We're going to be flipping emotionally and educationally across those 2 realms, I think, over the next number of years. I think university managers need to be very careful how they manage their staff. And as staff members, we need to be very careful how we interact with each other, but also with our students as well, because there is another pandemic on the way, and that's the one of mental health that we need to be very, very mindful of as well. So thank you very much, Brian.
Our next speaker is Rob Savage, Director of the Centre for Irish Studies at Boston College.
Thanks, Brian. I'd like to start by speaking about what works, and I guess talk about how the faculty got together last summer and started meeting on Friday afternoons, late Friday afternoons, for I guess what was then referred to as a Zoom tail. What we really found was that there was what we missed was the sort of sense of community that no longer existed because we were all at home and not able to gather together. And we were also wanted to stay in touch with friends in Dublin, especially the director of the BC Ireland, Mike Cronin, and Joe Nugent, a colleague of ours that had gone back to Ireland. We started meeting on Friday afternoons, and our group of faculty expanded. We started having other friends join us. And after a while, both Joe Nugent and Mike Cronin suggested sort of developing a series that would be hosted in Dublin on Fridays, where Joe and Mike would interview a number of guests. This was something that the Department of Foreign Affairs actually supported. The consulate in Boston got behind, and we developed something called the Irish Influence. And again, this came out of Dublin. It was Joe Nugent and Mike Cronin who began to interview a number of artists and writers, novelists, poets, academics, and filmmakers. And this developed traction and developed an audience. And we found it worked really well. Joe and Mike would interview novelists, including Kevin Barry, Eilish McGuivna, filmmaker Lenny Abrahamson, Emily Pine. Tonight, Henry Glassy is going to be featured in this Irish Influence. And we were really surprised that an audience developed that would sometimes number about 150 people. The problem for us was that this was something that we did at 4:30. Well, it was done at 9:30 in Dublin, 4:30 in Boston. It found an international audience, but we wanted to figure out a way to get it into the classroom. And what we've been able to do is record these 1-hour sessions, edit them, and then find a way to make them work into the classrooms that we're teaching. And this was one way to try and use the technology to help us. And we have a public lecture series, people that come through Boston College that will meet with the students. This is a way to try and address that gap, and also continue to support the community, both within our university and outside of it. The other sort of challenges of teaching during the pandemic for us has been sort of working with our undergraduates. We teach about half of our courses in person. So I teach a course with 22 students in a hall that sits 250. So we're able to socially distance. It's done with masks, but there's a real disconnect with our undergraduates. And we can sense that the undergraduate community is unsettled. I mean, they're unsettled by the pandemic, but unsettled by other issues here in the United States about controversies about racial justice, social justice. And one thing we've been able to do is work with the students. In the past, in the classroom, you can talk about these things. A lot of my colleagues haven't been able to do that because it's just not the same being on Zoom. What we've been able to do is work with partners within the university, including African and African diaspora studies, to encourage the students to develop webinars so they can reach out to each other. They can't go out and protest. Any kind of protest or demonstrations on campus have to be registered, have to be socially distanced. It's just also very awkward. But we've been able to successfully encourage a number of student-run webinars that have tackled issues for social justice, to bring on politicians, activists, academics, to talk about the challenge of things like police reform, which is what we're going to be doing on Tuesday. So, to conclude, although, we've done a lot of work with YouTube broadcasts and Zoom, there's really no substitute for in-person, engagement. And so I, want to echo what Kate and Andre had said before. It's critical for us to, especially for our graduate students, to help them meet academics, poets, and writers, to develop networks that can help their research. And we've noticed this, especially with the grad students, that they really miss that sense of community. They really crave being able to engage with each other, with faculty, with visitors. And we're all looking forward to a time when we can once again see each other and share a pint in person and not remotely. So I'll leave it there.
Rob. Our next speaker is Chris Morash from Trinity College Dublin, where he is the Seamus Heaney Chair, and I am going to share my screen. And Chris, away you go.
Thanks very much, Breen. Yeah, what I'm doing in some ways is almost a kind of counterpart to what Michael Brown started us off with. And I think where Michael found that the experience of the pandemic for him produced kind of reflections on the spirit, for me it produced something that's almost the counterpart to that, and that's reflection on the body and the body in place. As a kind of irony, I mean, just as the whole pandemic was starting, I was finishing up an article that's coming out in the Canadian Journal of Irish Studies on the transatlantic telegraph. And I was starting to become fascinated with the way in which, when the first telegraph went across the Atlantic, initially in 1858 and then in 1866, there was a kind of, almost a kind of fetish made of the cable itself. And particularly in New York, there were hymns that were composed to be sung in churches to the cable. There were sermons preached. There was a piece of the cable paraded down Fifth Avenue. And it seemed like that kind of moment of kind of global communication was a kind of inaugural moment for me of a moment where we started to idolize global communication as an intrinsic good for its own sake. And what I was trying to do with the article was try to replace that by reminding us that the cable didn't just, go across the Atlantic. It went from Valentia Island, opposite where the largest workhouse during the famine was in Carasavine, to Heart's Content in Newfoundland, where there was real hunger and real poverty, particularly in the outports. So it was that idea of kind of, if you like, replacing that history of technology. And the phrase that kept being used and kept coming up in those accounts of the cable going across in the 1850s and 1860s was the annihilation of time and space. And I suppose the irony of that struck me over the past year, where I think, like all of us, I've had that experience of the annihilation of time and space in our teaching. I mean, for instance, next Tuesday night between about 10 p.m. and midnight here, I'll be co-teaching a seminar in Berkeley with Catherine Flynn on Irish drama. And that kind of strange sense of me here in my room at midnight talking about By the Bog of Cats while she's talking about it with her students in California, it's just become kind of normal. So what I wanted to do with my own teaching here in Trinity was to try to replace it, if you like, and imagine the hyphen in that word. Because I suppose I asked, what is it that students are missing most? One of the things I think they're missing most was one another, was that kind of interaction. So one of the things I have done with my own teaching is, as much as possible, involve students in interacting with one another between classes. To the point of, with one module, actually letting them set the syllabus for the second half of the module and doing that between each class. And they're digital natives, and they find their way to one another offline much more efficiently than I could ever facilitate. And that's worked very well. But the other thing I think that students have missed is the city, is missed Dublin. That one of the things of being in Trinity is being in the centre of the city. So I've been teaching an MPhil module called Mapping Literary Dublin. And it's about the city in literature, and particularly the way in which literature changes and creates our experience of the city. So I started doing something which I suppose I could have done before, but I doubt if I would have done if the primary classroom interface wasn't a screen, and that is using the map as a kind of tool of literary and cultural analysis. So I have all the students in the class making literary maps. And the one you have there on the screen in front of you was made by a student named Gerald Griffin, and I just picked it at random, and I think Jared, you're watching, so thanks for this one. And he did a map of John McGahern's Dublin. Now, this is a sort of a kind of detail of it. And if you go to the next slide there, Breen, for instance, he goes to the Stag's Head pub, and one of the reasons I picked Jared's map is because I know that an image of the Stag's Head pub will make an audience of Irish studies scholars salivate. There's a kind of Pavlovian effect there, so I'm shameless about that. But he produced this, has the image of the Stag's Head pub, has pieces from McGahern's writings talking about the Stag's Head pub. He also has other sites on the map. If you go to the next slide there, Breen, for instance, the Ambassador Cinema and McGahern's writing about cinema, and so on. And so what he would have done is produce this map using Google Maps, using the My Maps feature in Google Maps, easy to learn how to use, and then presented that to the class. And the entire class would have made these maps, and it would have presented them over the course of seminars. And one of the effects of this is using the kind of distancing technology of teaching online to ask us to think about its opposite, about being in place, about being in a particular place, about being in the city. What does it mean to replace literature in its site of production, in its site of consumption, in the city itself? So I suppose what I've been doing with my teaching, to some extent then, is using the kind of technological transcendence that it affords us, this annihilation of time and space, as a way of reflecting upon what that means, what the cost of that means, and of trying to literally replace it. So in a sense, I've been replacing my teaching. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll now go to Untitled Chapter. Vrianna, will twinchen. Yeah. So Professor Brian Mcateer, the O'Donnell Chair of Irish Language and Literature here at Notre Dame.
I'm going to speak briefly, I hope, and I'm sure you will stop me if I don't. I came home to Ireland in March 2020 for spring break, and I'm still here, which of course, needless to say, had huge implications for my teaching. In March, Notre Dame closed its doors and dispersed its students throughout the US, so we had to go online. I was teaching two courses, one a film course, Screening the Irish Troubles, and the other was called Modern Irish Classics, which encompasses the revival and the big writers, both in Irish and English, from Joyce to Yeats, Pearse to Heaney to the Blasket Islanders. And I found, to be honest with you, what I really what Cleona said to me, and indeed Nessa picked it up as well, was that idea of that increased intimacy, which of course is juxtaposed with that increased isolation as well. I'm here, not speaking to anyone. I'm in North Tipperary. I haven't seen my colleagues in over a year. I haven't seen my students except virtually. But I have actually found it quite an intimate experience. I have classes of 25, 27. I've got 40 one-on-one classes this year. In one of the classes is 41 students. The other is 25. It makes for very hard work. But I meet the students individually 3 times in the semester, one-on-one Zooms, which is boosted by a weekly paper that they write to me. I write back. Now, at the stage of my career that I'm in, I can do that. I don't have to chase after writing papers. I don't have to chase after, more publications to keep me where I am. So in that sense, I'm lucky. I can actually concentrate on undergraduate teaching. But I have to say, I have found this the most satisfying undergraduate teaching that I've ever done. It's also, I think also my courses, probably being one of them being film, really lends itself to an online approach. But also, I think with a more text-based course, such as Modern Irish Classics, or the West of Ireland, what it made me do is to approach it in a much more interdisciplinary fashion, particularly looking for more and more visual material. For example, Yeats, we read Yeats, and this is an introductory course, so this is not a postgrad. We read Yeats, but also I show them a couple of different documentaries, one being Bob Geldof's highly opinionated documentary. They write a paper about that. We have a class discussion about that. So I cut down on the amount of material, but we approach it in different ways. Again, it aids critical thinking. They're looking at something, they've got to analyze that. Is this right? Do I believe Bob Geldof when he says this? How does this pair with what I've read? So I must say I found it very rewarding personally. And also the thing it makes me think about is, what is Irish studies about, particularly during a pandemic? What are we doing here? Reading stories written by Peg and Tomás O'Shen back in the Blaskets in the 1950s, 40s, and 50s. I just want to end with this. This is what one of my students at the end of the first semester wrote. I asked them all to write just really how the pandemic had affected them as for the last weekly paper. This girl, she's a young female student. She's from Asian background, so not Irish. So this was not a legacy student in that way at all. And this is what she said. I'm going to leave you with this. Overall, Modern Irish Classics did not end up teaching me. Sorry, I lost the damn thing now. Did not end up teaching me what I thought it would. Bear with me. Overall, Modern Irish Classics did not end up teaching me the lessons that I expected from this semester. I knew I was going to read a bit more about Irish history and literature, but I did not think that I would learn all the reasons why I should be more like the writers themselves. Not quite sure about that one. I found out the same virtues that all the writers wrote about in their work are the same ones that I need to cherish more during this pandemic. It is because of this class I am more generous to strangers, more willing to fight for my neighbours by staying inside, and more grateful for the extra time I get to spend with my family. I will never forget these stories and what they taught me. And I hope to read more in the future.
We will now go to Edinburgh, where Professor Enda Delaney teaches in the history department at the University of Edinburgh, and where he is in the Irish Studies programme. Enda.
Thank you very much, Breen, and thank you also to Patrick for the work that you both do on the Global Irish Network. I've really 2 points, which, given that we're coming towards the end, you'll be probably glad to hear. The first one I would summarise as the Diaspora Strikes Back. That's not just a reference to Star Wars, but also to the famous collection that you will know, The Empire Strikes Back. And I think one of the effects of the pandemic and the use of technology is that the centre of gravity for matters relating to Ireland has shifted to all those nodes of the diaspora across the world, and including many of those which we've heard from today. And our seminar, which previously had maybe 15, 20 people every so often, now has 60, 70 people attending from across the world. So there's been a great opening up. And I think that's something that, for me personally, is a really important element, that some of the best work in Irish studies is done outside of Ireland, which I think we all know, and there's a sort of a creative tension with what goes on in Ireland. For historians, I haven't done a scientific study of this, but I think there's actually more historians of Ireland working outside of Ireland, north and south, today, than which I think is interesting in itself, because these people, no matter where they come from, adopt global transnational approaches. They often have a very strong comparative element because they're working in departments where there may be the only Irish historian or one or two Irish historians, and that brings, I think, a broader perspective that really enhances the work. The Global Irish Revolution project that I've been involved with Fergal McGarry at Queen's and Rob Savage at Boston College, I think that's a very good example where we have developed an international team to look at what essentially is seen by many Irish people as very much a domestic event, the Irish Revolution, and we've brought a whole new set of perspectives to that. A slightly sort of discordant note, or at least one that I think that's worth talking about, is the relationship between Irish studies and indeed Irish history. I think we can all look back and remember those sort of fairly cranky debates about revisionism and all that in the 1990s, and that was the other ceasefire that occurred between historians and literary scholars. But I think one of the sort of unintended consequences of that has been a retreat to sort of disciplinary boundaries, particularly for historians. And while there was a lot of sort of ill will and perhaps more heat than light, there was definitely serious intellectual issues that literary scholars concerned with the past raised about the writing of Irish history. And I personally regret that sort of dialogue has not continued. Historians very rarely engage with Irish literary studies now, seeing that as being something quite different. So I would see Irish studies not as a discipline, but really as a space where people can come together with their different perspectives and their different methodologies to look at these issues. And I think if you want to see an example of this, and I'll just finish on this, Breen, is all the work that's being done on the revolution in Ireland, which has been really dominated by historians. Other disciplines haven't got anywhere near the same amount of coverage as historians have. Whereas you compare that with the commemoration of the famine in the 1990s, that was just as much dominated, I think, by literary scholars, including Chris Morash and others. I think that's something that perhaps we could perhaps reflect on in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Enda. And our final speaker is Professor Maliki O'Neill, Provost at the University of Ulster. Maliki, Araglat.
Gure Céad Maigin, Brian as an Curry, agus Lunar War Arm, George Liv, a leg in new, again, Oka. So I hope to offer really both a personal and a professional reflection on my experiences of lockdown. I suppose January 2020 brought a lot of promise, particularly to the north of Ireland with the reinstatement of of governance from Stormont. It brought a lot of hope and excitement for me personally, because in my role as provost, I was responsible for one of the key projects in the development of Ulster University's Mcateer campus in Derry, which was the inception of a graduate entry medical school, and that was one of the commitments which emanated from the New Decade New Approach agreement, which was announced at the end of January. We were also engaged in the development of City Deal innovation negotiations with the government at Westminster, and in the process of unlocking some £250 million in innovation funding for the city. And in terms of the Ulster University itself, as many of you will be familiar with the fact we're a 4-campus operation. We have the vast majority of our students are in the Greater Belfast area between our Belfast and Georgetown campuses. and we have 2 north by northwest campuses at Coleraine and the campus I'm responsible for at Mcateer in Derry. It's been mentioned already by Kate that we have the privilege of hosting ACIS from Derry, unfortunately, rather than in Derry come June. But who knows what the future may bring in that regard. So in terms of my role as provost and essentially how lockdown has brought me back to my beloved Irish studies, is that the end of the spring semester for 2020 was related purely around the kind of the pivot that everyone has talked about to date, the pivot from the traditional face-to-face experience of campus life to the new norm, which was the fact that we taught our students from our own offices, at home, at times our own kitchens, and indeed in some cases our own bedrooms. And the reality is that dichotomy between intimacy and isolation has been alluded to by Cliona, Nyasa, and Breonna already. Became very, very apparent, probably more so to my colleagues who were engaged in that face-to-face interaction with students, more so than myself. Then came the summer break, and we all hoped for a resumption of some form of normality in the autumn or the fall semester. But obviously, as we entered lockdown 2.0 in this part of the world, then the realization arrived that the traditional experience was still some distance away. Fast forward then for me to late November, early December last year, and the Tom Maguire, our head of School of Arts and Humanities at Ulster, approached me in relation to some teaching in the second semester. And due to my role as provost, my involvement in face-to-face teaching had diminished significantly in the past couple of years, and it was a challenge for me personally to step away from my subject and offer that campus leadership rather than the comfort zone that is one's own subject. So I was approached by the head of school who asked me to consider what options we might have for a module that I had designed previously as a former head of school in professional Irish. And the module that I had designed some 3-4 years previous to that involved significant engagement with partner organisations, with the Irish language sector, with community organisations, and essentially involved placing a number of our students with agencies for a period in order to address to provide opportunities in problem-based learning and the kind of project work that many of our graduates would engage with, and they sought. We provided opportunities and experience with agencies like locally Derry City and Strabane District Council. Our proximity to the Donegal Gaeltacht facilitated opportunities for our students with many cultural organisations that were Irish speaking, and it was a phenomenally rich and rewarding experience for our students. I was faced then with the conundrum of how do you bring the Irish language sector into the homes of our students if we can't bring the students to the sector. And I found through that online pivot that actually we have been able to engage in a much wider myriad of experiences for our students. I've conducted a re-engagement with our alumni network, and we've sought opportunities to engage alumni across a wide range of professions which involve the use of the Irish language day and daily. And we've been able to offer our students insights into the fact that alumni of their program are in roles in professional capacities such as broadcasters with Sky Sports, or Irish language officers for national organisations like like the GAA, and it was a phenomenal experience for our students to get an insight from the likes of Gráinne McElwain, who's a Sky Sports presenter, graduate of our programme, Jamie O'Toole, who's the Irish language officer for Cumulnúchta Scale, who was able to give a virtual tour of Park and Croquet to our students and to beam that into their homes.
Maliki, could I interrupt you just for 1 second, because a couple of questions have come in which are directly pertinent to what you're discussing, and if I could ask you to respond. How do you think the teaching of the Irish language in Irish studies programs will be impacted in the post-COVID era, and will we see Irish language classes being zoomed from Ireland into the US or Europe?
Yeah, and I think that's the opportunity here, that moon and gas shifts, as we say, and the reality is that we've been forced to be quite shiftual and quite innovative in our approaches to these challenges. I see many more opportunities for that active learning process for our Irish language learners who don't reside on the island of Ireland, to experience the kind of engagement, the kind of interaction that is part and parcel of that language experience, and that notion of a virtual Gaeltacht, if you like, is a much more achievable is much more achievable in the post-COVID context than it might have been envisaged previously. And even events like today, it would have been inconceivable that you would have been able to bring together colleagues from as broad a range of institutions as you have done, Brian, in such a short space of time, and that's now achievable because we aren't as caught up with traveling to conferences. We have I feel more engagement with our student body, and I think we also need to be cognizant of that intimacy versus isolation. I was really taken aback by and this will be a barrier for language learners, in that the reluctance of our young students in particular, who are and it relates to the challenges around image consciousness, to for example share images of to share their screen, to engage. And the module I was teaching in professional Irish, I found it incredible that our students were so reluctant to turn on their cameras, and I actually asked some of my fellow tutors, is it just me, or does this happen across the piece? And I was really taken aback to see that some of the individuals I would have perceived to be quite overtly confident, to them actually to be quite reluctant to engage in that manner. And I think that is a challenge for language learning going forward. But I see much more opportunities than challenges therein. We have another question. I wonder if any of the panelists might talk about the way that Eugene Wall's note regarding the loss of cultural capital through digital conferences particularly affects junior faculty, contingent faculty, and more vulnerable faculty. Feel free to jump in. Cleona?
I'll jump in there, Brian. Oh, sorry, Cleona.
Go ahead. I mean, for me, the networking, when one is at the beginning of one's career, the networking opportunities afforded by in-person conferences are really invaluable, I think, because you can feel both isolated and shy. And I think that the conferences that I attended at the beginning of my career, really, I have a great memory of the ACES conference that I attended in New York. And I think that the welcoming atmosphere, the fact that senior academics, were reaching out, that was extremely important. And at the same time, I was able to travel to that conference because my university, stumped up and helped me with the costs. So I think the flip side of the digital conferences is, as Kate pointed out, is the affordability, the fact that people can attend without having travel costs. So I think it's double-edged.
Lovely. Nessa, please.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this as well, and there was kind of two suggestions I was thinking that we could do maybe in Irish studies that I've seen work really well in other disciplines. I suppose I work a lot in geography as well. So the first maybe is integrating more panels at conferences in terms of workshops and mentoring for early career scholars. I think that's really, really important. I think we could do more on that in Irish studies. This is kind of integral. It's kind of embedded in a lot of American studies conferences in geography and in the British geographers as well. They have these big strands as part of it where they're mentoring and workshopping early career scholars either for grant funding applications or for job applications as well, how to write your CV kind of thing, you know. So that's the first thing I think we could do better. The second thing, and it's something again that we kind of decided to do in Irish Studies in Galway last summer in terms of rethinking everything in terms of the student for 2020-2021, was our Irish Studies seminar series this semester is very much about foregrounding graduate work and merging early career scholars in conversation with more established scholars in the field internationally. So we have a series of seminars going where we will have early career scholars either presenting their work or responding to work with international scholars. So that presents the opportunity that Cleona was mentioning to have that kind of conversation, but having it over Zoom. There's advantages to it because we can now invite whoever we want, but disadvantages in that we don't have the cup on tea in the chat afterwards, you know.
Lovely.
But
I
think
just
it's our
ask Kate
responsibility to do that. Yeah.
Sorry, Nessa, Maliki. I'll just ask Kate to jump in.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, I'm glad, Cleona, the ACIS was that experience for you. And I do think actually between what Nessa and Cleona are saying, I think we're going to find that we need some kind of compromise. You can't say hybrid anymore because now it means something different. But, you know, I think on the ground is so important for the students. And also we have to find ways to be inclusive of people whose universities just can't or won't support them in their travel. So I'm interested, and I know that's something that the ACIS is going to be discussing going forward. But I also wanted to mention to Nessa's point that Andre actually implemented that very kind of mentoring for IASIL. So I just wanted to give him the nod in case he wouldn't give it to himself.
Okay, we have a specific question for Professor Morash. Will the map-making experience change how you teach topography and place in literature, and how will Irish language translation come into this? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it will actually, and I suppose that's one of the things I was kind of reflecting on, was that this is not something I would have done in a normal teaching situation, face to face. Just would have been kind of awkward. Whereas when your main teaching interface is a screen, it's a natural thing to do to work with this technology. So yes, I've been using it actually in an undergraduate course. I've been using it in a postgraduate course, and I will continue to use mapping as a kind of tool of literary analysis. And I could see how that could also work very interestingly in say in areas like geography, and particularly looking at place names and so on. So yeah.
Thank you very, very much. With 2 minutes to go, I will thank all our participants. My apologies for cutting across you and trying to keep you on time. Thank you to the audience, and I'll hand back over to Professor Patrick Griffin.
First off, Breen, thank you so much for bringing everybody together. And I think what we've seen today is almost the best and worst of Zoom. The best is it's so easy to get together with people that you already know and kind of reconstitute community in some way. I'm looking at so many of the people here that I know and how delightful it is to see you, but it's the worst because right now we're going to leave this kind of virtual room and go on with our lives and pick up our next task, whatever it's going to be, when there are so many things you want to follow up on and so many people you want to catch up with. And that's, I think, the sort of bind that we find ourselves in. I think the Global Irish Network was one way for us to try to constitute some sort of community this year. And I hope and indeed that it grows next year and that we can do more and more of this stuff. As we're saying, we wouldn't have imagined these opportunities before, but now we have them before this and we're beginning to realize them. But we can't do it at the expense of the human. To me, that was another theme that came out directly, particularly when Nessa, Cleona, and then Kate were just giving their answers to the question that Breen posed to them. It's that we can't have one without the other. And I think that's going to be the next frontier that we're going to be tackling is how can we kind of keep this going, but at the same time not forget that we do need to get together and we have to work hard and we have to overcome institutional inertia in order to make that happen. I think our overlords in all of our various disciplines and all of our various universities are going to see, well, you can do it online. That's just the easy way of doing it. But I think we have to push back against that to ensure that we can meet face to face. We owe it to ourselves, but particularly we owe it to our students because they're not going to have the same sorts of experiences as well. So that would be my plea to us as we think about next year. I will say this one thing, I'll just end with this. I hope all of you in this year, you and your families are doing as well as can be expected. And let me end where Michael Brown started us, with a little kind of nod to mortality, but also the transcendent. God bless you all and be well.
Thank you. Goodbye. Stay safe.